Hello, students of U.S. history. This lecture is focused on the Salem witch trials. And for those of you who have ever done any sort of research or watched movies or heard about the Salem witch trials or even visited Salem and learned more about the Salem witch trials, the focus tends to be around the cruelty and the thinking in which we lived in a world where this traditionalism and belief could affect people and actually convince people not to think rationally and to rely on a body of evidence that was completely circumstantial. But what I want to talk about links more to our class, because in this class, we're trying to talk about the identity of the American character. And often you'll hear the argument that America was founded as a Christian nation, and our laws are based on Christian philosophy. At the same time, we have to compare the way that America was developed as this Christian nation compared to England, where most of these Puritans came from. So you have to compare the organization of the church. So think about the Church of England for a second. So back in England, the church is a central church, and it is officiated by the king or queen as the head of the church. And there is a Archbishop of Canterbury who's like the Pope of the church, the director of the church. And then there are lesser bishops, and the bishops have lesser archbishops, and so on. And you have priests and local parish organization. But everybody has the official authority under the king and under the Archbishop of Canterbury. When the Puritans come to America, one of the big arguments they have about the Church of England is they don't like this hierarchy. They don't believe that there should be a small body of people who make decisions for the lower levels and so on. They believed in local authority because they believed that local parish priests knew what their community needed, so local ministers should have the most authority over the way that they preach to their parishioners. Now this in theory sounds great. This is somewhat of a more democratic philosophy, that it's decentralized down to the local level and that a higher order does not make all the decisions for the lesser churches. The problem with this type of system, though, is there is a lack of oversight. So there's already a lack of oversight in America because there's this concept of salutary neglect, where England is involved in other issues and they can't be focused on everything going on in the colonies. So they do leave regional governors in power in order to make some of the more minute decisions. But even major decisions like law and order is not the same from place to place as you go in each of the colonies. And even within the colonies, you don't have somewhat like a state police or even a nationalized, organized government, where each colony is divided in its own fashion. It's run in a different way, maybe, that you have elected representatives maybe to a body, but those bodies don't necessarily administer the laws the same everywhere around the colony. So now we get to Salem. And if you didn't know this already, Salem was not just like Salem, Massachusetts today. It wasn't the downtown area where we see all the famous sites. Salem was a huge expanse of land. There were different zones of Salem. There was Salem town, which is what we think of as Salem today, the neck of Salem, where the historical sites are. But then there was also Salem Village. And Salem Village today is the contemporary towns of Danvers and Peabody, which would eventually separate from Danvers and form its own town, Peabody, and Danvers would break away from Salem later on after the Salem witch trials. But at this point, it's all considered to be the area of Salem. Although Salem Village and Salem Town are completely different in their way they administer law and the way that life works. Salem Town is a bustling community of traders and sailors, and it's not necessarily as much hardcore Puritan. Whereas you go to Salem Village, it's a little more rural, agrarian, a little more traditional, and there they focus a lot of their attention to the old traditional religious beliefs that they don't want to adapt. They don't necessarily want to change to where the way some other parts of the colonies are going. They want to stay in this, purify the church, keep the church as the forefront, and although we do have civil authority, church matters really are equal, if not trump, civil matters. So that's the mindset that we're in, that we have to think about this American identity. We didn't form all in the same way. In Boston even you had more secularism going on as the Puritans became the ruling class, and they did have some sort of belief that they were better than other religions. but the Puritan beliefs were different depending on your class, depending on what town you lived in, depending on who your minister was, because the minister really was the one who gave you the authority to sort of bend the laws based on your status. So when we think of Salem, we think of this period of time in which there's a lack of central authority. There is a heightened sense of fear because of these Native American wars that have been going on. We had talked about the Pequot War. King Philip's War had gone on in the 1670s. And now we're getting to a point where people are willing to believe out of fear, not out of rational thought. Because even the whole concept of witchcraft, when we think of Salem the witch trials, we have to question whether, did the average American truly believe that witches existed? Did they buy into this witchcraft hysteria because of their respect for their minister and for the Puritan church? Were they easily swayed because they were looking for excitement in their lives? So it's not just one-dimensional that we think of that these Puritans believe truly in witchcraft. They accuse these women of being witches because of Tituba, this slave who convinced these young women to do strange things, and then eventually they were hung out of this just crazy hysteria. We have to look beyond that just general story. So when we think of the Salem witch trials, we have to think that the majority of the people that were accused of being witches were upper class women. And the majority of the afflicted, the ones who were experiencing this possession, were lower class women. So here we already have this class differentiation where you see the upper class women being accused, the ones who are being put on trial, and maybe perhaps there was some jealousy in there. Another aspect is why women being accused over men. Men could be witches just as much as men could be the witches over women just as easily in the European tradition. But we do see this differentiation between gender, that women are not treated with the same status as men. And although, yes, we do have some examples like Giles Corey, who's pressed to death, for the most part, the witches were women, the ones that were accused of being witches. Now, obviously, we know the witches don't exist in the sense that the Christian faith was referring to them as these devil worshippers who engaged in the magical practices. You know, we do have the Wiccan belief. We do have that recognized understanding of what a witch is, but not to the extent to which the Salem witch trials were punishing these women. So, what's going to come out of the Salem witch trials that's positive? Although many of these women die, many of them are not found guilty because the court system still has some sort of rational authority saying there's not enough evidence to condemn all these women. So at the end of the Salem witch trials, it goes throughout the colonies that this is what happens when you don't deal with rational order, when you let law just go rampant and you let the church basically dictate who's guilty of a crime. So you're going to start to see a rippling effect through the colonies where two big movements are going to come out of this Salem witch trial. Now, it's not because directly of the Salem witch trials, but this is going to be an example of how when authority is unchecked and when it's regionalized, it can have an adverse effect if there's not a oversight in order to keep order. So the first thing that's going to happen is people are going to start to see rational thought may have a place over this traditional belief. And this rational thought is going to come out of many philosophers in Europe, and some in America later, like Thomas Jefferson, but that's going to be much later. This idea of enlightenment, that in order for you to believe something, there needs to be evidence. There needs to be rational belief, not just what you think because of your faith, but actually tangible evidence that you can use to prove something. And so you're going to get to see a rise in sciences in America. And you're going to see a breakaway from this standardized Puritan church. And in doing so, you're going to have a second movement called the Great Awakening. Again, don't think that the Salem witch trials is the only factor, but it's one of many that would cause these rifts. And the Great Awakening, instead of being a scientific movement focused on rational thought, actually is going to say this whole idea of regional power is a good idea, but there needs to be different ways of connecting with God. It can't be that the minister has this very harsh policy towards everything and that if you're not a Puritan, there's something wrong with you. There needs to be more personal connection to God, and there needs to be more organization about what people actually believe in rather than what they're told to do. So people start to get a choice as to what religion they're part of. And although religious toleration is slow in Massachusetts, other parts of the country, religious toleration is taking off. In Rhode Island, in Pennsylvania, in some of the southern colonies, you start to see people breaking out into these new faiths, Baptists, Congregationalists. You start to see a rise of Presbyterians. You see the Episcopalian, the Church of England taking place. But it's not a state-sponsored church anymore like you had under Puritan New England. You start to see this burgeoning of different faiths. And in doing so, people are given more choice. And that idea of, I have a choice of what I practice based on what I believe in, is going to be a very foundational idea of American identity. That I'm not beholden to a single faith. That I do have that freedom of religion. And from the Enlightenment, I'm going to get that idea that I don't only have to believe in what I'm told to by my elders. I can use rational thought in order to scientifically and ethically and systematically prove what is fair and true and what is unfair and false. So when we think of the Salem witch trials, we can look back and we can feel sorry for all of the horror that happened to the women that died, and that can be our guiding light. But we must also look at all the strength that came out of this horrible event. I always say that there's a lot of positives that come out of horrible events, because hopefully it teaches us a lesson about what we shouldn't do and a better way to live, that we can improve ourselves, thus fulfilling the concept of history, that history shouldn't repeat itself, that we should learn from our mistakes. So the Salem witch trials is really going to help us to form, along with other events that are equally crazy throughout American history, to form this more identity of choice, that we should be able to choose who we are, how we think, the freedom of thought, the freedom of speech, the freedom of rational ideas. And this is going to be a foundation for American identity.